Thank you so much for coming tonight. Another beautiful night by Wannsee. We're delighted to have Martin Puchner talk to us tonight. He's the Byron and Anita Wien Professor of English and Comparative Literature at Harvard University. And his topic tonight is the written world, storytelling from Mesopotamia to the moon. And I'm expecting he will definitively prove that the man on the moon is not a story. Or maybe it is a story, that he can disprove other things. But let me first welcome Christine Wally, one of our trustees who's here, right there. Thank you so much for coming, Christine. I also, as I went down the guest list tonight, I realized we have fully 4 professors from Freie Universität. So you're all welcome. Thank you also for coming. Our closest university in geographic proximity, at least. So Martin, apart from being the Byron and Anita Wien Professor of English and Comparative Literature at Harvard, he also serves there as the founding director of the Mellon School of Theatre and Performance Research. And, as if that weren't enough, he's also the general editor of the Norton Anthology of World Literature, which for any of you who've ever seen the Norton Anthologies is a lot of work. So Martin crams a lot in. He is going to be talking, his talk tonight will be based on his book, which is a bestseller already, The Written World, How Literature Shaped History. And the German translation, which I guess just came out, is Die Macht der Schrift, Wie Literatur, die Geschichte der Menschheit formte. And both in English and German, it's available outside. If you haven't already bought it, I would encourage you. It's a great read, and I enjoyed it a lot myself. He will say in that book at the very beginning, it is hard to imagine the world without literature. And he doesn't just mean that as an abstract sense. How could our world be without literature? And so, Martin, with that, I welcome you up to start your talk, and afterwards we'll have a little Q&A session. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Terry, for this introduction, and thank you, American Academy, for creating this incredible environment for conversation and thought. In particular, thank you to the Birkeland family that is making my stay here at the Academy and this talk tonight possible. And thank you in the audience. Wonderful to see many old friends, some new friends. And those of you I don't know, I hope to get to know the reception afterwards. So once upon a time, I was a normal literary critic focusing on 19th and 20th century literature. But then about 15 years ago, as Terry mentioned, I became the general editor of this Norton Anthology of World Literature that went from the invention of writing and arrived about 6,000 pages later in the 20th century. And that experience really changed how I think about literature in culture. I realized that there were really fundamental questions about literature and culture that not only did I not have answers to, but that I hadn't even asked myself, such as when and under what circumstances was writing created? How often was writing invented by humans? What were the main stages of literary and cultural evolution? In other words, I'd been studying stories all my life, but there was one story I had not paid attention to, one story I had not really studied but to any extent, and that was the story of literature itself. And so this is the story I want to sketch for you a little bit today, and that's the story I tried to sketch in this book, Die Macht der Schrift. As you can see, there are a couple of letters that are missing. I apologize for that. The English tradition has all the letters, fortunately, so that's good. Okay, so the story of literature. It's always a good idea when you tell a story to start at the beginning. But where to begin? There's, of course, storytelling, oral storytelling, that's existed as long as humans have existed. There have been societies without the wheel, but we have yet to find a human society without storytelling. We seem to be really, in a fundamental sense, storytelling animals. That's how we make sense of the world and of ourselves and our place in the world. But at some point, this oral storytelling tradition intersected with a technology, namely writing. And that is my point of departure. That's really the big bang of literature, written stories, that intersection. Now we know writing was first invented in Mesopotamia. And so this is where that intersection happened for the first time. But it's always difficult to point to a moment of origin, especially as in the case of writing, when it's about 5,000 years ago. Now, fortunately, there is a story about the invention of writing that Mesopotamian scribes, the very people who had mastered this new technology, told and wrote down about the origin of their profession and their technique. And I think that this story is as close as we are going to get to that moment of origin. So this is how the story goes. It's set in Uruk, in today's Iraq. And Uruk was really one of the first cities made possible by new developments in agriculture, allowing for the first time to humans, for larger numbers of humans, to amass in one place and live off the proceeds of the hinterland. So these first city-states emerge, projecting their power further afield. The story about the origin of writing, it takes place in Uruk, and it features a king of Uruk, who has the signs on the mountain realm of Arata. So he takes a messenger and sends the messenger up into the mountain realm of Arata, demanding allegiance and submission. The king of Arata is not very impressed by this demand, sends the messenger back to the king of Uruk with a challenge. If the king of Uruk manages to take grain, and the grain is really what powers this city-state of Uruk, and put grain in nets and transport it up into the mountains, maybe then he would submit to Uruk. The king of Uruk thinks about it. He takes grain, he lets them sprout. Then he is able to put them in nets. He gives them to the messenger. The messenger runs back up into the mountains. But the king of Arata, the mountain king of Arata, is still not impressed. He sends the messenger back with a second challenge and a third challenge. And the king of Uruk is getting angrier and angrier because somehow this recalcitrant king of Arata is still not submitting. So he lets out this long rant. And the messenger standing next to him panics because he can't remember the long rant. It's at this moment in the story about the origin of writing that the angry king of Uruk takes some clay from the ground, turns it into a clay tablet, puts his words onto the tablet, gives the tablet to the messenger in an envelope. This is from the Harvard Art Archive, sends the messenger one more time up into the mountains to the king of Arata. The king of Arata takes this clay tablet, it's only as large as a hand, holds it to his ear, there's no voice forthcoming, and then in front of his whole court, he's so impressed by this new technology, by the king of Uruk's ability to put his words, press his words onto clay, that he submits to Uruk. Okay, so this is the story about the invention of writing, and there are two things that are interesting, I think, for us about this story. The first is that it's clearly, in many ways, a self-serving story told by scribes about the power of their technology over which they have dominion, right? Where threats of invasion and violence did not succeed, this little thing, this handheld device, this first text message sent from one angry king to another angry king, I'm letting you make all the contemporary references, succeeded. Okay. The other thing about the story that's interesting to me is that it still has nothing to do with literature. It's a text message, it's a diplomatic threat, and the Mesopotamian scribes knew, and were right about this, that for many hundreds of years, the early uses of writing, of this technology, were in fact bureaucratic, recording economic transactions, creating a first state bureaucracy that really allowed these city-states to project their power further afield, really creating the first territorial empires. And that was the use of writing recorded and captured by this story about the origin of writing. But at some point, one of these accountants and it pains me as a literary scholar to say that writing was really invented by accountants. I like accountants. One of these accountants took this accounting technology and put it to a very different use, and that is to write down a story. And that's really that intersection of storytelling and writing technologies. That's sort of the red thread through my history of literature, and explains to some extent the focus on technologies. Because when you change one part of the equation, namely writing technologies, you will also change the kinds of stories that are written down, how they're written down, how they circulate, and how literature is shaped. So that's the core idea here. And because, at least according to the story, writing was first invented in Uruk, it makes sense that the first great work of world literature, namely the Epic of Gilgamesh, is set in Uruk. It features King Gilgamesh, a king of Uruk who rebuilds the city wall. And it is the Epic of Gilgamesh, most interesting to me, is really very proud of this city. It's clear that this is a work that's proud of the fact that this is really the first urban civilization in some sense. And it's a civilization, as described in the epic, made out of clay. King Gilgamesh has rebuilt the city wall made out of clay bricks. Houses are made out of clay. The agricultural products of the hinterland are brought into the city in clay pots. There were even clay sickles. So it's really a clay-based civilization, if you will. But the most important use of clay is exactly this. It's as a material on which this first full writing system, cuneiform writing, Keilschrift in German, was created by making marks onto clay. And the Epic of Gilgamesh celebrates writing as a great achievement of this civilization. King Gilgamesh himself is a writer king. He knows how to write. And this makes for an interesting contrast to other later epics, like the Homeric epics, which present themselves as being sung orally. The Odyssey even has part of the adventures of Odysseus be performed by Odysseus himself live at the court of the Phaeacians. And in fact, there is no writing at all in the world of Homer, with one small exception. Not so in the much earlier Epic of Gilgamesh, which celebrates writing as a great achievement. So this is what we have now. We have this intersection of writing technologies and storytelling, and we have the emergence of the first, I call them foundational texts that become reference points for entire cultures. Fragments from the Epic of Gilgamesh were found all over the Middle East, so it's clear that along with power, these city-states and first territorial empires exported parts of this foundational text. And the same thing happens whenever societies develop writing. Oral storytelling intersects with writing technologies, and we have these foundational texts in Egypt, in India, in China. It's a poetry collection, so the shapes of these texts are different, but they all become foundational texts. And that's, in some sense, the first stage, the first chapter in the story of literature. I want to move on to the next stage, which is sort of a variant of the first. And that story starts, in fact, not very far from Uruk in Babylon. And it's set during Babylonian exile of the Jewish people. Jerusalem has fallen. Parts of its population has been forced into exile. And it's in Babylon, which is, in a way, the part of the center of this very elaborate writing culture, that some of these Jewish exiles become Babylonian scribes. And one of them is the scribe, Ezra, here imagined by Christian medieval painters, illuminators. So Ezra the scribe is a Babylonian scribe, but he's unhappy with this position, and he asks the king for permission to lead a group of Jewish exiles back into Jerusalem. The permission is given. They come back to many hundreds of miles, the desert mountains, come back to Jerusalem. They are discover that the city has fallen into disuse. The city walls have crumbled. The city is half abandoned. And so they start to rebuild the city, to rebuild the city walls, and above all, to rebuild the temple in order to reinstitute Judaism as a temple practice. But they do something else. Ezra, as I said, a Babylonian scribe, and other scribes have added to the stories, the written stories of the Jewish people in exile. And in exile, bereft of king and temple, these stories have become more and more important. And so when they come back, Ezra does something really crucial. And he stages it very carefully. He builds a wooden platform, perhaps like this one, and he calls everybody together. And then he steps out onto the platform and he holds up the Torah scrolls, and he demands that the people worship these scrolls as if they were a god. And for me, that's a scene that captures a new stage, if you will, in the story of literature, namely the idea of sacred scripture, of holy scripture. Now, we are, of course, very used to this idea of holy scripture. I would say today it's almost impossible to think of a world religion without some kind of idea of a holy scripture behind it. Even the concept of, I think, religion is now part of this idea of Holy Scripture. But like all things, this idea that writing, which, as I said, just started as something very mundane, namely an accounting technology, that it would be associated with divinity did not go without saying. And I think this is one of the scenes of Ezra holding up the scrolls and the people worshiping them, where that captures this idea of Holy Scripture. And I think this stage, the second stage, if you will, in the story of literatures, has had enormous consequences, not just because of universal world religions with their holy scriptures that determine our world today, but because this idea of holy scriptures also migrated in other domains, including political texts. I'm thinking of the Declaration of Independence and the US Constitution. I'm thinking of the Communist Manifesto, other political stories that have acquired some version of this status of holy scripture. So this is, in a way, the second stage. I want to rush on to the next stage, which takes place in a very different kind of scene. It doesn't feature a king like Gilgamesh or the king of Uruk, the earlier king of Uruk, nor a scribe like Ezra, but it features a teacher or several teachers, because this kind of scene takes place in several of the most advanced literary cultures of the time. So it's a scene that features a teacher and who has assembled a group of students around him. At this stage in development, they're all men. So a teacher introducing new ways of thinking and new ways of being to their students and followers, and often they become very popular, amassing more and more students around them who often leave their families and their old lives behind in order to follow these new teachers. Now, as I've been describing them, I'm sure many of you have started to generate some names that might be associated with these kinds of charismatic teachers that that emerged from the most literate societies. One of these teachers is the Buddha in India, here always represented as surrounded by their students. In China, the most well-known of these teachers, in China they're called master teachers, is of course Confucius, here depicted in the company of his favorite pupils. In Greece, name of this teacher is Socrates, again depicted surrounded by his students, by David, at the moment of his death, and Jesus surrounded by his pupils. Now, there are many things that are interesting about these patterns, these teachers that emerge within a few hundred years of each other in the ancient world. Philosopher Karl Jaspers noticed them and coined the term Achsenzeit, axial age, because he felt like there's a new form of self-reflexive thinking that entered the world through them. They introduced some of the most important religions and philosophical traditions, including Western philosophy through Socrates and Indian philosophy through the Buddha. But in my context, in the context of this intersection of storytelling and writing, the most interesting pattern, the most interesting things these four and other master teachers have in common is that none of them wrote a single word. Which is interesting, because as I said, they all lived in some of the most literate societies of their time, which raises the question, why? Why did they not write? Why did they not use this great new technology for projecting and disseminating their teaching, which they cared about? Now, Socrates, among those four, is the one who was most explicit about his reasons for avoiding writing. He had several worries about writing. The main was that if you write something down, it's very easy to lose control over it, because you can never ask a text follow-up questions. It can be easily taken out of context and falsified, and people can manipulate it outside the author's control. He also worried that he really thought of writing as a kind of external storage device, that the more we would rely on these external storage devices, the less we would have to know ourselves, and that our minds would in fact atrophy. Not unlike what we worry about today when our kids are only on their iPhones, and we feel like it's going to mess with their minds. So Socrates had a similar idea, and maybe we can extrapolate that these other teachers who likewise could have written but refused to write as well. So this is what we have. No problem. These teachers are charismatic teachers. They assemble these large group of followers. They preach to them. They live with their followers, and all is well until the inevitable happens and these teachers die. In the case of the Buddha and Confucius, of natural causes. In the case of Socrates and Jesus, a violent death. And now the students and pupils are confronted with a very interesting dilemma. Namely, should they follow their teacher's mode of live transmission and oral interaction with their followers and remember their words that way, or should they do what their teachers refuse to do, namely write down their words? In some cases, in the case of the Buddha, it took many hundreds of years till the words of the Buddha were written down. In other cases, case of Socrates and Jesus, it happened relatively quickly, but sooner or later, it always happened. Students, followers, sometimes generations later, used writing, even though their teachers had deliberately refused to use writing and wrote down their teacher's words. Now, it's very easy to describe them as traders. After all, and of course, as teachers, I know that students always do exactly the opposite of what you tell them to do. But it's easy to describe them as traders, but I think that's too harsh. In fact, we should be grateful for them. Everything we know about these figures, we know from students who wrote down their words. And they were clever. These students realized, of course, that their teachers had emphasized this live interaction, oral transmission. And so they incorporated that into these texts they wrote. And that means that these texts have a very oral, dramatic flavor. Plato, the student of Socrates who wrote down his words, even wrote them as dramatic, almost as plays, as dramatic dialogues that were sometimes performed. Students of these other teachers likewise created a very vivid new type of text that's much easier to read and that carries something of the oral flavor on which their teachers insisted. So I think of this third chapter in the story of literature as a kind of interesting refusal to write or a rejection, a kind of Luddite moment, if you will. But this rejection was then channeled back into writing and actually created a new type of very influential text, because it's an interesting thing that the texts emerging from these students were some of the most successful texts, instituting universal religions that were no longer addressed to just one group or one class or one tribe, and traditions of philosophical thought. Now, I said I would emphasize writing technologies, and I have lost track of that a little bit. But it's, in fact, texts emerging from that complicated interaction of not writing and then writing nevertheless that we can see the importance of new writing technologies. And as an illustration, I want to use this. It's a depiction of the Buddha, again surrounded by his pupils. It's one of the texts written down many generations after the Buddha's texts, called the Diamond Sutra. And the good thing about writing was, of course, it allowed monks to carry these Buddhist sutras further and further afield, from India to China, where they were translated into Chinese. This is a Chinese version of the Buddhist sutra. And it was in China where these texts encountered two of the most important technologies in writing. And one was paper, and the other was print. This copy of the Diamond Sutra is the earliest surviving printed text in the world, from 868. So many hundreds of years before Gutenberg. What interests me about that is that it would be a Buddhist sutra that clearly is something like an early adopter of these new writing technologies. And it actually makes sense because these Buddhist sutras, they, like texts emerging from these other students, were proselytizing. They tried to win over followers. In fact, these Buddhist sutras promised their readers and the monks carrying them rewards if they taught these sutras to others. So there, we can almost think, I almost think of them as sort of like a biological species that's trying to replicate itself. So paper and print, both of which lowered the cost of replicating literature, was of course perfect for these Buddhist texts and Buddhist monks who had a lot of investment in winning followers. So a sacred text coming out of this interaction of a teacher who refused to write and students who wrote down his words becomes the proselytizing early adopter of paper and print. Now I want to follow a little bit what happens to these two technologies, especially paper. Paper developed first in China, then gets exported to other parts of the Far East, but then gets introduced into the Arabic world. And there are, in fact, quite dramatic stories about how that is supposed to have happened. There is the story of the Battle of Talas, where an Arabic army and a Chinese army clashed, and the Arabs win. There are lots of Chinese prisoners of war. Some of these Chinese prisoners of war have the secret of paper making, and somehow the Arabs extract the secret from them. We don't know by what means. There's no reason to believe that this is actually how it happened, but the story, like the story about the origin of writing, captures something of the values attached to this technology. It shows how important this technology of paper was seen to be. So through this or some other mechanism, paper enters the Arabic world. Baghdad becomes the center of paper making. In many ways, this new, cheaper method of producing literature or material on which to produce literature is one of the fuels for the golden age of Arabic letters. And then to follow this paper trail a little further, paper gets finally introduced to Europe via the Arabic-occupied part of Spain, Al-Andalus, and I would say just in time for what we now have to call the second invention or the reinvention of print by Gutenberg. And the interesting thing is that somehow history repeats itself, because again, it's a religious sacred text that becomes the early adopter of this newly or reinvented technology. The Latin Bible, the Vulgate, is the first great work that Gutenberg, of course, prints. So one can start to see a pattern here where the where sacred texts become, as I said, the early adopters. They are often in the best position to use new technologies. In the Arabic world, after some hesitation, they're beautiful calligraphic copies of the Quran, of course, that are written on paper, and now the Vulgate, the Latin Bible. But there's another side to this technological story, and that has to do with the fact that, as I said, both paper and print dropped the price of producing literature, both together and separately. The Arabic world, adopting the secret of paper making, showed very little interest in the other Chinese technology with which it had gone hand in hand in China, namely print. There's no print in the Arabic world, so the effects of paper, the effects of technology in the Arabic world was just the effect of paper, of dropping the price. But in Northern Europe with Gutenberg, these two technologies reconnect. Paper through this paper trail, the Arabic world, Al-Andalus, Northern Europe, and this idea reinvention of print by Gutenberg. We don't know exactly how much Gutenberg knew of Chinese print, but he knew something. He's really not the inventor of print by a long shot, though he was a clever person. I think of him more as a kind of modern style entrepreneur or venture capitalist. He in fact raised secret money. He operated outside the guild system, raised money with non-disclosure agreements because he realized not that he had invented print, but that this invention that other people were using in a very primitive form could be perfected, and there's a whole market if you made little invention along the way, creating almost like the first assembly line, production line, that there is huge potential. So it's more like someone like Steve Jobs, who recognizes the potential of others' invention. And so this is what happens with Gutenberg. But as I said, there is a second side to what happens when you drop the cost of something, and that's an explosion of popular literature. And this is something that happened in China with paper and print. This is something that happened in the Arabic world. The story collection 1001 Nights is perhaps a good example of that. And it's something that happens again in Northern Europe. And the name, you will have guessed it, associated with that is, of course, Martin Luther. And that's a well-known part of the story. But what interests me is this pattern. On the one hand, the early adopters, the Diamond Sutra, the Quran is not quite an early adopter, but ultimately adopts paper. And here, the Vulgate, the Latin Bible, and then, of course, Bibles translated into the various European and later non-European vernaculars, and an explosion of more popular storytelling and writing in China, in the Near East, and now in Europe. And so we enter the world that's essentially familiar to us, namely the world of print, the world in which now new figures dominate, figures like professional authors who invent original stories, who increasingly own copyright over these stories and sell the story through print to a mass public. New genres that started in the Middle Ages but now become dominant, like the novel, for an increasing mass audience. And of course, what interests me in the story is our current moment, because this world of Gutenberg, of print, the world we know, is coming to an end before our very eyes. We are living through one of these rare moments when new technologies are changing how we produce literature, how literature gets distributed, how literature is read, and how it circulates. So I think we can all feel that this change is very fundamental to how our societies function. So in a sense, this story is the prehistory of our current moment, what happened, and my interest was to look at patterns of what happened at earlier moments when new technologies change the written world. I promised that I would end with the man on the moon. Not the man on the moon, but with the moon. This is, of course, a picture you all know, taken by William Anders, an astronaut aboard Apollo 8. the mission, the first time that humans leave terrestrial orbit and shoot out towards the moon. Apollo 8 didn't land on the moon, it orbited the moon. Why do I start a story of literature with Apollo 8? Really two reasons. The first is a small reason, but perhaps more important than the second, and that is that these three astronauts aboard Apollo 8, who had really nothing to do with literature, they'd spent their entire lives on Air Force bases and in this kind of world, found themselves in this unusual position to have left the Earth and were looking at Earth from a distance. And they were supposed to look at the moon and describe what the moon was like. Their visual recording equipment kept malfunctioning. So ground control said that you poets need to use words. And so they used words, and very interesting words. They almost created their own kind of poetic language to describe this experience of being out there in space. Some using more kind of existentialist vocabulary, some using a vocabulary that I would associate with the American poetic tradition of imagism. Very moving that these three astronauts without literary training really came up with their own version in the sense of the sublime to capture this experience. But the main reason is another one. So Apollo 8 kept circling the moon and would lose radio contact for about 45 minutes until it reappeared on the other side, from the far side of the moon, and there was always a lot of nail biting. Would they make it back, and so on and so forth. The mission had fallen behind. There were all kinds of small technical problems, so the atmosphere aboard Apollo 8 was getting very tense. But despite all of that, besides these technical problems, the three astronauts did stage the following scene, and they had planned it very carefully. They had rehearsed it. And so when they reappeared finally from the far side of the moon, they said that they had a message for Earth. And this was the most televised moment in the history of humankind at the time. They had a message for Earth, and the message was the following. And then they took turns reading the opening paragraphs of Genesis. Very moving moment, and I think the first poetic reading in space.
A couple of things I'd like to pick up on. One that is a little bit more mentioned in your book than you mentioned tonight. So writing invented 5,000 years ago in Mesopotamia. We think also writing invented in the Americas.
Yes.
But you say in your book possibly only two. There's some suggestion the Chinese and the bones. I mean, so how many times was writing actually invented?
No, I find it one of the most fascinating questions. I'm glad you asked it. So I mean, the basic idea is that all these the earliest writing cultures, Mesopotamia, China, Egypt, China, they're of course all on one landmass, the Eurasian landmass, and they were at least in indirect contact with each other. So it's possible, it's very hard to prove it one way or the other. It's possible that the Chinese invented writing independently, but it's also possible that it got there by some form of idea transfer. And that, in fact, humans invented only writing, the idea of writing, only once. The actual writing system quite different. But we know that we humans have come up with the idea of writing at least twice because of the Mayans. Mm-hmm. So when the Spanish conquistadores arrive in the New World with their newly printed Bibles, which have shrunk into smaller formats, in which they're very proud and shove into the faces of all kinds of people they meet. Most of the societies they meet in the Americas have not developed writing, or only sort of proto-writing systems, but with one very significant exception, namely the Mayans. So in the Mayas, they encounter a society that has completely independently, without contact to the Eurasian continent, developed writing. Not just writing, it becomes almost, for me, it became sort of almost like a control experiment. Would the same things happen again in the Americas that basically happen in these writing cultures on the Eurasian continent? And they did. So there's a class of scribes. There is the intersection of writing and storytelling. There's the great Mayan epic, the Popol Vuh, which I love. So that's the story. So this becomes really, when the Spaniards arrive in Yucatan in southern Mexico, a battle of the books, a battle of different writing cultures. I think this whole tradition of Mayan writing and Mayan literature, in part because it's been relatively recently redeciphered, is much too little known. 2,000 years of Mayan literature, really fascinating and completely, until contact, independent and autonomous. It's a very moving idea to me.
So let me push this a bit further in terms of survivability of languages.
Yes.
There are about 7,000 languages extant today. But the predictions are, for various reasons, modernization and encroachment of our advanced civilizations,
yes.
That by 2050, most of those will be gone.
Yes.
And it's clear we've lost a lot of languages in the past. And precisely, languages actually go extinct. So Latin is no longer spoken, but it's not an extinct language, it's a dead language.
Right.
But languages go extinct basically because they were never written down.
Well, so, right. No, I mean, so this is a fascinating area. So, I mean, the very idea of a dead language didn't exist before writing, of course. Because before writing, languages disappear.
Yeah.
So it's one of the gifts of writing that we have to study dead languages, maybe a kind of ambivalent gift. But yeah, so they're dead languages. But this question of survival, it became, for me, as I was writing this book and editing this anthology, more and more, how do these texts, how did they make it to our own era? And some of these stories are very dramatic. In the case of the Mayans, it's particularly moving to me because so there are these Mayan scribes. They realize that the Spaniards are burning Mayan books. They're wiping out the civilization because they realize that they can't really convert Mayans effectively as long as they have their own sacred books. So they try to burn them all. So the Mayan scribes who are trying to save their text, Popol Vuh, they do two things. They copy it and hide it. But that's not enough because they realize that the whole Mayan glyph, the writing system, will be wiped out and no one will be able to understand it. So they write down their sacred texts in the Latin alphabet, in the alphabet of the victor, because they anticipate that that's the only way in which this text will survive. And so they do what, of course, they didn't know about the Epic of Gilgamesh, but what the scribes charged with preserving the Epic of Gilgamesh did not do, because the Epic of Gilgamesh was never transliterated into a different writing system, which means that once cuneiform writing fell out of use, the Epic of Gilgamesh disappeared without trace, and we didn't even know it existed. And it was rediscovered by chance in the 19th century and then painstakingly deciphered. So if you want your text to survive, just the one good thing about the Epic of Gilgamesh was that it was written on clay, because the library in which it was housed burned down, as all libraries do sooner or later. If it had been written on papyrus or paper, of course, it would have burned up. Good thing about clay is if you burn it, it doesn't burn up, it gets harder. So in a sense, the only reason these clay tablets survived is because the library was burned down and hardened these tablets so that they survived for 2,000 years. But yeah, so there's a complicated relation between the material, clay, papyrus, paper, and the writing system and how those interact and how those guarantee survival.
Okay, so you set me up perfectly for a question I'm wanting to ask you about your current project here at the Academy, because the book that you talked about now is done. The Epic of Gilgamesh, as you say, was lost until 1845, I think?
Yes, that's right, 48. Yeah.
48. Enormous amount of time it was lost. So if somebody hadn't chanced on that in the desert, right, we might never have had it.
Yes.
And hence extinct. Your project here in the Academy is about a very interesting language that very few people, certainly I hadn't heard of, Roodwelsch. Mm. And explain to us why that language has not been completely lost because of this connection with writing, because I find this totally fascinating. Yeah. And give us the background of this extraordinary language. And then we'll open up to questions on the floor.
Very good. Yeah, so this is sort of a little side project that is weirdly connected to this big project, in that it's a project about Roodwelsch, so a thief's language, an underground language that was spoken in Central Europe from the late Middle Ages to the 20th century. In fact, one of the first people to write about it and, in a sense, against it was Martin Luther. So it was a thieves' language. It was a combination of German, Yiddish, and Hebrew. But it was a purely spoken language. The only people who wrote it down or wrote about it were its enemies, beginning with Martin Luther. And the main written record of this language is a police record, because the police started to get interested in this underground language, a sort of a secret language that they couldn't understand. So this is how you can reconstruct the language, by going through police records from the 18th, 19th, and 20th century. Now, this is all very obscure, and what does this have to do with literature and any of these things? Well, there's a weird personal connection in that I grew up around this language. Not because I come from a family of thieves, but because of this man, my uncle, Günther Puchner, who devoted his life to rescuing this language and who taught me bits of it as I was growing up. He was a composer who at some point discovered this language and then became obsessed with it, started to incorporate words from it into his poetry. And in this book, he takes bits of world literature, including the balcony scene of Romeo and Juliet, the scene where Don Quixote fights against the windmills, perhaps appropriately so, parts of the Bible, and translate it into a Rotwelsch and actually managed to publish it. The publisher went out of business soon thereafter. Into this language only he could speak. So he died very early of a brain aneurysm in his 40s, and I inherited his archive. He had assembled this incredible Rotwelsch archive, and I've been carrying it around with me for 25 years, always thinking at some point I have to do something with it, and it's a project I'm finishing here.
It's almost like a story about Borges. You write a book about a language that nobody else can understand.
Exactly.
Who has questions? Please, yes, ma'am. Please wait for the microphone so we can pick you up. Thank you.
I'm curious what you know about the history of the written language and storytelling from the pre-Columbian Olmec people.
Yeah, so the Olmec civilization is really the predecessor to the Mayan. So the Olmec civilization feeds, that's the earliest origins of Mayan writing systems. And so it's the Olmecs that then feed into the Mayans. So by saying that the Mayans are the only ones, I was simplifying things. There are various versions of Mayan writing systems, and it ultimately goes back to the Olmecs. So you're absolutely right to mention them. So when I said there's 2,000 years of Mayan writing, that includes Olmecs, yes. It's in the same region, yeah.
So we do Fred and then this gentleman here, please.
Thank you, Martin, for your talk. I have another question from the pre-Columbian context, and that is, where does the tradition of knotted strings fit in? Is this a later development?
Yeah.
It's certainly not the same kind of writing.
It's not the same kind of writing, but I'm glad you mentioned it, because these are the Incas, and there's actually, so there's always been clear that these knotted strings were symbols and that they were served purposes of communication. But there's actually just right now happening a lot of research around those, and it's clear that those knotted strings are much more complex than previously thought. So there could be an argument, there's sort of an argument emerging that, so you have in Mesoamerica, you have the Mayans, you have sort of proto-picture writing among the Aztecs, and you have those beaded strings in the south with the Incas, and that's another completely independent. We could spend a lot of time debating whether this is exactly writing, whether it really captures the full complexities of language or not, but it's certainly an advanced, complex sign system around which there is a lot of scholarship right now. And I think that I see sort of people are starting to make the argument that it really should be considered writing. So that's very fascinating to watch, because it's a completely different kind of writing system than either the Mayan glyphs, who are so in some remote way could be compared to Egyptian hieroglyphics. It's very intriguing, and it will be fascinating to see what emerges from that scholarship. Mm.
That's a perfect pitch for the question I wanted to ask about alphabets, which you mentioned very briefly. Do you think of an alphabet as a technology in your terms, and how often have alphabets been invented?
So I do think of it as a technology, and it's a very powerful technology. And it's clear that many of the early writing systems usually develop out of pictographs or logographs, then signs start to do double duty, representing often combinations of sounds. That happens in Egypt, happens in different parts. The alphabet, as we know it, is often attributed to Phoenicians. It gets then introduced to Greece, where, and so I write about it in my chapter on Homer. The interesting thing about Homer is that Homer gets written down more or less immediately after the introduction of the alphabet to Greece. And the conventional story goes that the Greek alphabet completes the alphabet. That's a little bit of a back projection. What people mean is that the Phoenician alphabet is like all Semitic alphabets, mostly consonants, or what we would consider consonants. In the Greek alphabet, vowels get introduced, and what's intriguing about it is this connection with Homer. So there's a lot of controversy around this as well, but there are people who make, to my mind, really intriguing argument, namely that, so Homer sung in hexameter, the Greek language, in a sense, especially when it is used for the hexameter, very vowel-based, andra, moiene, pimusa, these wonderful long Greek vowels, that the vowels get added, and in a sense, the Greek alphabet created for the purpose of writing down Homer. Now, you can't prove it, but it happens around that time. So this would be an alphabet that would be shaped for the purpose of writing down one of these oral traditions. So yes, and then it's interesting the way in which the alphabet really sweeps away many other writing systems. One of the agents here in my story is Alexander the Great. Of course, brings the Greek alphabet to such large part of the world, and it's clear that the alphabet, is a big winner, but not everywhere. East Asia takes much longer, and in many ways still resists. China, the alphabet. So it's interesting, this idea of this technology. It's so much easier. It also severs writing from meaning, which is a kind of really weird conceptual breakthrough that's required here. But it's interesting that even today, the alphabet has not complete domination. There's a wonderful recent book about the Chinese typewriter that sort of talks about that. So there's also a way in which our new technologies make non-alphabetic writings easier to use. So it's sort of a story of the alphabet wiping out many other writing systems, but not all. So very interesting. Yeah.
Sir, we got three here. These two gentlemen and then the lady behind.
Do you have any explanation why we have 24 letters?
Well, we have in fact many more. Depending on, the alphabet has to be, because it's connected to, not to meaning, but to sounds, so very laboriously formatted and shaped to different languages, and many have many more letters. But the basic idea, the advantage of the alphabet is that you basically chop out language into individual sounds. So you can create more sounds or fewer sounds, but between 25 and 40 seems to be sort of the convenient way of reducing the different sounds we make when we speak. It's an act of abstraction, right? Of abstraction and analysis, of really chopping up words into meaningless sound units. So that's sort of the way it works. But there are of course huge debates about which alphabets to use, especially, for example, in a colonial area. And part of the post-colonial struggles, for example, in Africa, was about introducing new alphabets, not using the alphabets of the victors, and so on and so forth. So fascinating stories about that, and not wanting to use alphabets. They were developed to represent very different language. And so then you have to create all kinds of diacritical marks and so on and so forth. But essentially, the basic idea is to take this continuum of sound that we use when we speak and abstract from it and chop it into a convenient number of units. Yeah.
I was going to ask a question, but it was so beautiful. You ended up by answering my question without me having to ask it. Because when you said so beautifully that the alphabet severs writing from meaning, I was going to write this down because I like it so much. And then I thought I'd better ask you before writing it down so as to understand what you mean by that.
Yeah. You're using an alphabetic
yeah,
I do.
I got the thing with the abstraction, but is that in general for alphabets? Is that really in severing writing from meaning?
Yes, because if you think of many of the older syllabaries, you would have a word, you'd have a sign for a concept or an object. Let's say fire. And then that same sign, one sign, would start to also be used for a combination of sounds like phi. So you'd have you could write in a syllabary. You could write something based on these sounds, combinations of sounds, but the sign would still be connected to an idea or an object, like fire. So that connection to meaning, that's what I meant by saying would still be connected to meaning. In a pure alphabet, you don't have that anymore because it's pure sound. So what you do is basically you take language, and I think it's seems so natural to us, but it isn't, because if you use language is meaning. It's exchanging meaningful sentences. So basically what you have to say when you create an alphabet is to say, let's not worry about the thing that's most important about language, namely meaning. Let's just think about sound, purely the sound, and let's represent sound. And then out of these meaningless sound units, we can recompose meaningful words.
The lady there with the glasses.
At the beginning of your talk, you called us storytelling animals. And I would like to ask you about the term narrative. It has become very popular. Some people feel it's being used too often.
Okay.
Do you feel we need narratives to understand our world, or to force others to understand them the way we would like to see them?
Yeah, a good question. So I think, in a way, it's... In a weird way, it's not even up to us. I think narratives or stories are how we understand the world. And in a way, this is what I try to describe in the book, really how narratives change the world. But this, of course, means that, this is not to say that all narratives are the right ones or all narratives are good. And I think we see this very much today, when there's a lot of hand-wringing about facts and fake news and so on and so forth. Especially, let's take climate change. And I think there's a sense that for 40 years, climate science has basically said, there are these skeptics about climate. And we had a talk earlier by one of the fellows who was going in this direction. We need better climate science. If we have better climate science, these skeptics will be convinced. So we need more facts about climate science. Well, this hasn't worked out so well. So I think what we're realizing, and I'm part of a group at Harvard that is trying to think about this systematically, is that you basically can't win when you confront stories with facts. It doesn't work. You need a different story. And I think this is the conclusion I've come to.
Hi. So I've been wondering about the longevity of media, since these clay tablets managed to stick around for 5,000 years, and you could still read them. That's an obvious one. Books, on the other hand, are a little more brittle, I guess, and will fall apart more easily, and over time, that is.
Yes.
And I was wondering, and that's a hypothetical question, how would you see literature moving on.
Yes.
Like, if I wrote a book in 200 years,
Yeah.
how would it be published, and would it be remembered? Because obviously it's not a clay tablet, which is rigid, solid.
Right.
But if it's loose in lucid form, like an email would be,
Yeah.
how would you see that?
Yeah. No,
living on?
it's a great question, and I think I would distinguish between a couple of different things. On the one hand, the material on which writing happens, clay, paper, and so on and so forth. Then what you mention is something I would describe as format, namely the book, the Roman Codex, is a new format, different from the scroll, different from the tablet. And the reason why I brought this, because what's interesting to me about our current writing revolution is that some of these older forms, like the tablet, are back for the first time in thousands of years. People are writing on tablets again. The format of the book basically wiped out the earlier format of the scroll, except in certain religious services, for example. In Jewish services, you still have the Torah scrolls. But for all intents and purposes, the scroll was wiped out. Well, we are scrolling down our computer screens. So in some sense, scrolling is back because computers encode text as a continuous scroll, and that in discrete pages can simulate pages. So there's the format. So, okay, so we have today, for the first time, for most of the history I'm telling, huge resources are necessary to preserve a text, to copy it, to house it in something like the first libraries, and so on and so forth. So if something is no longer used, it disappears. For the first time, because it consumes a lot of resources, for the first time now, the cost, as they say, of storage are basically converging on zero. So storage is becoming more or less free. But that's not necessarily going to guarantee longevity, in part because of the second term I used, namely formats. Already now, no computer can read floppy disks. The people in writing about media technology are really worried about the obsolescence, the incredibly fast obsolescence of electronic formats and codes. So there's a real question about whether anyone in the future will be able to read any of the electronic writing we do right now. And librarians worry about this a lot and say, if you really want something to survive, print it out. Even better.
One in the back, and then we'll come here, and then we'll go to this gentleman here.
I'm just kind of curious about like isotypes and pictographic languages, and with these changes in technology, we now have emoticons and emojis that are influencing the way that writing is perceived. So just if you can comment on that, please.
Yeah. No, it's a great question, and you absolutely are. It's yet another thing that's coming back. So talking about the alphabet earlier, the story of the alphabet is often described as this kind of triumphal story, but here we have non-alphabetic, clearly signs returning in a big way with emoticons and others. So it's very interesting how that relation between alphabetic and non-alphabetic writing continues to evolve. Yeah, really great point.
So just a comment that everything that was written on the wax tablet had to be put on papyrus to be permanent, right? In a sense, the wax tablet never retained its the magic writing pad never retained its content.
It's true that wax has a certain permanence, but it's true that wax tablets, the point about wax tablets is that you could erase and rewrite. Right. So it was used for Sorry, you're not finished with your question.
That wasn't my question.
Okay, sorry, yes.
Alphabets and meaning. But alphabetical characters have names. Alpha, beta, gamma, delta, epsilon, alpha, omega, and they have meanings. So what's the difference between an alphabetical letter and the meaning of the word that signifies the letter?
Aleph, bet. Yeah, well, I mean, I suppose it is an interesting question. I mean, I suppose it just shows that, yes, you can reassemble alphabetic letters to have meanings, including the ones for alphabetic letters in a certain way. But
the word A, the letter A,
right,
had a meaning.
Right.
As did the letter omega.
Right, and especially, I would say, when writing gets associated including alphabetic writing as it did in the Hebrew Bible, with divinity, then people start to really then, each letter has its own, the Kabbalah develops around the meaning, the secret words of gods and the meanings of letters. So yes, it's true that this pure, meaningless alphabet gets immediately recharged with meaning. I think that's your point. No, it's a beautiful point. And just because you mentioned the wax tablet, and since I've been describing formats, in one chapter of the book I describe a first format war, because this is really what we're talking about between the codex and the book, invented by Romans along with the wax tablet, where these Roman wax tablets that are then bound into books became the preferred format for early Christians. And one of the ways to tell the story about the bifurcation between early Christianity and Judaism is this format war between the Roman codex and the Jewish scroll. Anyway, the wax tablet reminded me of that.
In a sense, my question's already been asked, but I want to ask it in a more pessimistic way. Since this post-alphabetic writing, at least since the 1960s, I think, people have been afraid that what it really means is post-literacy. Yes. But your story suggests something else. I was wondering...
I mean, look, I'm as worried about what's happening to this new generation of kids who are growing up with emoticons as anybody. But looking back, what gives me some hope, and maybe why I'm maybe more optimistic than you are, is that there are these fragments from ancient Egypt, from Egyptian scribal schools. There are two kinds of sort of scribblings. One is from students complaining about their teachers. These teachers are really hard, have bad handwriting, teachers beat me. We no longer do that. And then these fragments from teachers. This generation of students no longer cares about literature. It's all going to hell, and they are thousands of years old. So I suppose the conclusion I draw from that is that these moments of technological shift that are very fundamental introduce really fundamental changes, and they are scary. And I think in many ways we are right to be scared. But looking back, it's somewhat heartening to see that people living through similar technological change also had these kind of apocalyptic, fears, and that at some point these new technologies, a sort of equilibrium emerged around writing and authority and access to writing and so on and so forth. So, based on this long 4,000-year long history of writing revolutions and people worrying about them, I feel like maybe we are not entirely screwed after all.
There's a question up here.
Yeah, I just want to return to Apollo 8 and the far side of the moon. And I was wondering, so when the sacred script returns from the far side of the moon, is that really a story about how writing kind of returns in, or is being read to us again? Or is it not more a way of how this is a new sort of version of an oral culture, right? I mean, because in a way that's what it really is. It becomes performed rather than stored.
Right. No, I think very good point. And, it's interesting. I always expected, of course, when I embarked on this project, that in the beginning there would be this interest, I would have to think a lot about how oral traditions intersect with writing for the first time. What I didn't quite expect, but once you think about it, makes total sense, is that this relationship between oral and writing happens throughout the history of writing, and that each technology doesn't leave the oral behind, but basically just reconfigures the relation between the oral cultures and writing. This is one reason why one of the last chapters is about a great, again, much too little known African epic, the Epic of Sunjata, that commemorates a medieval empire in Western Africa, what's today Mali, but was transmitted orally for centuries and was only written down in the 20th century. And I, in fact, worked with a with one of the scholars who produced one written version, David Conrad, for the anthology, and I describe that in the book. So this oral culture and intersecting with writing happens all the time, and I think this is a perfect example of it. So Frank Borman, the commander of Apollo 8, had taken his printed Bible, used a typewriter, written the passage on fireproof paper because he was not allowed to take regular paper up to the moon, and then they, floating in space, so they didn't memorize it, floating in space, they would hand the paper from person to person as they read. So again, it was a kind of reconfiguration of oral storytelling and writing, and we see this with technology, audiobooks. That's the fastest growing market segment in book publication. So yet again, we see not writing or orality going away, but being reconfigured. Yeah, nice point.
Thank you for writing this book. It's truly amazing. I would like to come back to what you said about the distinction in the beginning between literature and text. And because I thought with the Apollo, it all the time occurred to me that the most important text is actually the code, getting them up there.
Yes.
So it's like this collective scribes,
right.
speaking in your term.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's true that in the cone of the capsule was really these early computer codes that got them up there, and computer languages, of course, are a fascinating area of study, and poets and experimental poets and other people have tried to work with computer codes. When I could never decide where to end, as you can probably tell, exactly where to end this book. And I thought, do I have to write about computer codes? Now, it seems to me that computer code, it's incredibly powerful, but for me, it actually doesn't, it plays less, it only plays an indirect role, in part because it makes computers and the internet and all of that possible. But for me, it's really about, transliterating stories, and computer code doesn't do that. It has another purpose. It's instructions to machines. So in that sense, I decided that computer code actually does not belong in this history of written stories, even though at least not as computer code. But I may you may convince me otherwise. But that was the conclusion I came to. Yeah.
So the print revolution pretty much did away with a large scribal class. And I'd like to know how you think the presence and subsequent disappearance of a scribal class as mediator has affected the ways we inherit stories and the stories themselves we have inherited.
Yeah, no, I think that's such a great point. It's interesting how different figures get associated with these different phases of literature. And for me, I thought, okay, if you had asked me where does literature come from, I'd say from authors, and how relatively authors are really latecomers into the world of literature, individual authors. So I think we lost a lot. But the interesting thing to me is that in some ways, I think we're not just returning to older formats like tablets here, but it seems to me we're actually returning to a mode of production that's, I think, closer to the work of scribes than anything that happened during the Gutenberg era. Because I think that the author, the professional writer who's access to the printing press, it's difficult to become an author, but then once you are an author, you can reach a mass public. The printing press, the bar to clear that is very high, that this author at the center of the literary system is basically disappearing. Every reader can become an author. There's a kind of radical democratization, a distinction between reader and author is becoming less important. And what is becoming important is exactly what scribes did, namely to collect things, to collate different sources and to patch them together. We call it curating or assembling or editing. or combining. And so I think that we are entering in a mode of production that actually is bringing us closer to scribes and farther away from the Gutenberg era and the professional author at the center of that. Yeah. So that will be very interesting to watch. Compilators, right? That all these terms that we now suddenly use for what's happening right now, much closer to the work of scribes than anything in the Gutenberg era.
Isn't it interesting how we congratulate ourselves for inventing something that's 2,000 years old?
Yes, very true.
We have time for one more question, I think. Thank you.
I had a question about the image of Ezra that you showed. Can we look at it again?
Yes.
He's writing in a codex, right?
That's right. So because it's medieval Christian,
right? Is that
so it's completely ahistorical.
But is that deliberate? Is it part of the same war in some sense? Is it a deliberate?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Appropriation of a.
Were they aware that Ezra would have written? Possible. I think I hadn't thought of it that way, but I think I think you're right, because these monks were producing this codex. They could have known that in synagogues you have the Torah scroll, and that Ezra would have dealt in scrolls, not Roman codices. Yeah, no.
I mean, I was wondering if it's a way of appropriating the Old Testament for.
Yes. Exactly. I mean, in a sense, this is the Old Testament as opposed to the Hebrew Bible.
Right,
exactly. And so I think that goes back to this format war between the Christian Roman Codex and the Torah scroll. Yeah, very nice. That's right. It's a shelf full of codices. Yeah.
Well, thank you all for your great questions. Martin, thank you for taking us from Mesopotamia to Rome.